So, to start part 2, let's look at the 4th place team in the Constructors' Championship, and that's Lotus Renault, Formula 1 team, who, despite finishing in 4th for a second straight year, managed to turn the team into a genuine top 2 contender over the course of the season, only just falling off towards the end due to the back surgery requirements of Kimi Raikkonen all of a sudden towards the end. I'll talk more about that again in a minute. But Lotus had 315 points for the season as a team. I think that's their highest total to date, and was only about 50 or so points away from the top 2, and I think they could have easily gotten a lot closer, like I said, if it wasn't for Raikkonen's back issues towards the second half of the year. Let's look at Raikkonen first. Now, Raikkonen wasn't quite as consistent as he was last year in terms of being able to score points all the time, and he was a little bit unlucky here and there in terms of performances and retirements, like the visor getting caught in his brake duct at Spa, which cost him a good chunk of points, and of course the back he injured at Singapore, which seemed to affect him for the rest of the season and caused him to not do or participate in the last 2 races. Raikkonen still finished with 183 points. He had 8 podiums. He had a race win, obviously he won the opening race in Australia, which many people seem to forget, and finished in 2nd place 6 times. Now, I can't remember the last time a driver has finished 6 times in a season. Has anybody got a guide for that? Has anybody got a fact? If we can dig that up. When was the last time a driver finished 6 times in a season? Finished in 2nd place 6 times in the season. Let me know. But Kimi also had 14 out of 18 races where he finished in the points. Fantastic consistency again from Kimi Raikkonen. And you have to consider as well, he did all of this while carrying a back injury from Singapore onwards, and was unpaid for the entire season. I'll be talking more about that in a minute. Towards the end of the review, but overall, Raikkonen once again shown why he is still one of the best drivers in Formula 1, still one of the most consistent drivers in Formula 1, doesn't make very many mistakes, and overall, I think he had another very solid year, and I think would have easily had 200 points again for the 2nd straight season if it wasn't for that back injury, and if he wasn't a little bit of a clot in Abu Dhabi for driving into the slide pod of a Caterham. I think it was a Caterham or a Marussia. I can't remember which one it was. Don't really care. Raikkonen just seemed to go home. I think he almost seemed to just throw in the towel with Lotus after Abu Dhabi, and it's a shame because I think he could have easily beaten Mark Webber for 3rd in the Constructors' Champion or for the Drivers' Championship for his 2nd straight 3rd place. If one of those things where hopefully he'll have to continue that run at Ferrari and maybe even take them over the top for a Constructors. Moving on to Romain Grosjean. Grosjean had 6 podiums overall in the season, finished with 132 points, which actually just went over my threshold for what I thought Grosjean was going to score in my bold prediction contest with 130. Now, it seemed to be that Grosjean was plodding along the first half of the year. Had a couple of issues. Seemed to be carrying his mediocrity from last season, but I think the Germany race lit a fire underneath him and showed what he could do if all the parts fell into place for Lotus. Having to yield over for Kimi Raikkonen on a faster strategy on the option tyre, challenging for Vettel for the race win, I think it seemed to motivate Grosjean to a point where it made him a better driver. Because the 2nd half of the year, Grosjean was phenomenal. He was the only guy giving Vettel a real challenge outside of his own teammate, really, besides maybe Nico Rosberg now and again. But Grosjean was fantastic. He had a stretch between retirements in Singapore through to Brazil, neither of which were his fault. In that block, there is 4 out of 5 times he was on the podium, didn't finish lower than 4th, and had a 2nd place in there as well. I think that was around the Circuit of the Americas, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, overall, a brilliant 2nd half of the year from Grosjean, and it seemed to shut down what some of the haters and some of the criticisers were saying about Grosjean, and it proved the guy is a top level talent when he wants to be, and he seemed to cure his spatial awareness problems and definitely work on it and channeling that raw speed he's always had into his performances, and it showed. All of a sudden now, looking into 2014, Grosjean now looks like he could be a top contender if Lotus Lotus can get themselves another decent car, and now driving forward with him as the team leader, the future could definitely be bright for Romain Grosjean. As for the car, I think Lotus may overall have had the second best car over the course of the season, because Lotus at the start of the season were able to look after their tyres better than just about any team in the field besides maybe Force India, and that was able to give the team alternate strategies to be able to run, like Kimi Raikkonen running a two-stopper and winning an Australia opening race. And the second half of the year, Lotus seemed to really improve. Their car was consistently very strong. It was pretty darn reliable for the most part, except towards the end when Grosjean had a bit of bad luck with the engine failure in Brazil. But overall, I think Lotus's car was extremely solid. It had very good pace. It was very good in its tires, which opened up different strategies for the team, and that's a very good thing to have in Formula 1. To have that kind of creative flexibility is definitely a plus point. And I think they were definitely better than Ferrari and on an equal, if not better, footing to Mercedes in the second half of the year. So it kind of showed that Lotus are definitely going places, and considering how the team had very little money to play with throughout the course of the season, clearly they couldn't pay Raikkonen's £15 million salary, that the team has got some real promise in there. However, I am taking away one subgrade for the treatment of Kimi Raikkonen from the whole team score, because you know what Raikkonen's salary is. You've got to pay the man. If you can't afford to pay the man, let him go at the start of the year rather than halfway through it and cause a right pandemonium of drama throughout the field, and often raising a lot of question marks about your team's financial stability. So I'm taking one subgrade off the whole team for that, but overall, Lotus were very, very strong this season.
In 5th place, and quite arguably the most disappointing team in Formula 1 this season, without doubt, McLaren. I don't know where it all went wrong for this team. They seemed to change up their formula from their 2012 Carbone that was arguably the fastest car in Formula 1 last season, and went with a car that had a different suspension setup, and it seemed to me like they had traded in their speed for a bit more reliability. And yeah, McLaren was bulletproof in terms of reliability this season, but they seemed to lose pretty much all of the raw pace the team had this year, and it suffered with both of their drivers, it suffered with when it comes to one guy's job security, and it made the whole team look worse. Which is a real shame, because, no one really likes to see McLaren do badly, really, to be honest. Well, I know I don't anyway. Let's talk about their drivers. Jenson Button, his highest finish was a 4th place in Brazil, finished with 73 points for the season. He was in the points 14 times, the same number as Kimi Raikkonen, funnily enough. 5 times he made the top 6, made very few mistakes over the course of the season, and, I think Jenson Button showed why he's still a top-level driver, because he just didn't make mistakes and just got on with the job. Yeah, he moaned a little bit at his teammate, but quite frankly, Sergio Perez was rather aggressive, and I don't think Button has ever really had an aggressive teammate gunning for him before in his Formula 1 before. Lewis Hamilton, I think, was always a little bit better than Jenson Button for the most part when they were at McLaren, but I don't think Button liked it when he was put under pressure from his own teammate, like in Bahrain when they were knocking wheels at 185 miles an hour. It's quite scary when that kind of thing happens. But Button didn't really make a lot of mistakes. He just seemed to get on with it like he always does. And I don't think he could have got much more out of that car if he tried. To score 73 points in that McLaren, which was never even in the top 4 in terms of car pace, a team that on paper should have been averaging maybe 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th kind of places. To score 73 points, I thought was a very phenomenal job over the course of the season, and Button deserves praise for being able to get that much out of a donkey, because that's what their car was over the course of the season. I'll talk about it a little bit more in a bit, but overall, Button I think was very, very solid, and it's a shame because the car made him look worse than what he really was this season. He's still a top-level guy. And if he has a slightly better McLaren next year, then look out, Jenson Button could easily be up there again next season. As for Sergio Perez, well, his highest finish was a 5th place in Japan. He scored 49 points overall. He was in the points 11 times. Now, Perez seemed to get a little bit more... This was a coming-of-age... Well, not really a coming-of-age, more of a reality check season for Sergio Perez that maybe we all kind of realised, maybe Perez isn't quite as good as we thought he was, considering his flash-in-the-pan season at Sauber last year. He scored 3 podiums and shocked a lot of people. And, he was a prime contender for a Ferrari seat, but instead ended up at McLaren. But yeah, I mean, overall... I think Perez was a little bit over-aggressive. He did a lot of controversial things like the pass on Raikkonen in Monaco. And just overall, I think he just wasn't as good as Button, which is kind of a harsh reason, I think, for the team to let him go. Because what was the yardstick for Perez, really? What were they expecting out of him when the car was so bad? But overall, I think Perez did a good job considering what he had. I think 50 points was about average given what his team was producing, and I think he wasn't bad at all, really. He often got the better of his teammate in qualifying as well. So Perez's raw pace has always been there. It's still there. I think he just needs a little bit of refinement, and he's still only 23 years old. He's got plenty of time for that to develop. Maybe Force India will be the answer for him, because I think he got a bit of a raw deal at McLaren. I think he was put under a lot of pressure after what he had to do last season, and despite that, I think scoring about 50 points isn't too bad given the circumstances. Maybe a little bit controversial in his actions, but yeah, I mean, hopefully it'll work out for better things next year for McLaren with Kevin Magnussen. As for the car, like I said, they seem to have solved the reliability problem of 2012, but as a downside, it cost them a ton of speed. They were the 5th best team in Formula 1 this season. They were the best in the mid-carders, and that's not what McLaren is all about. That is really disappointing for McLaren. McLaren are a consistent top 3 level team. So for them to finish in 5th this season is a massive disappointment. And it just showed that the team has got some serious work to do down in Woking. But would you really put it past them if they bounce back next year? McLaren have got an incredible team of resources, a team of engineers, some of the best in the business work at McLaren. I have every confidence they'll bounce back next year. And in fact, they showed a lot of speed in Brazil, the last race of this season. With Button starting 14th on the hard compound tyre and finishing in an incredible 4th place. And Sergio Perez started 16th and finished in 6th. So that seemed to show that McLaren were the 3rd best team on that day, behind the Ferrari of Fernando Alonso and Mark Webber. It seemed that McLaren were the real best of the rest that day and took advantage of other people's mistakes. And, it showed that McLaren still have something. And, that is going to probably send some positive vibes back to Woking for next season, because it showed that McLaren still have something. And if they can work on that and develop the car from there for next year, then there's no reason why McLaren can't bounce back. Positive signs towards the end, but overall, kind of disappointing for McLaren. They still had half-decent race pace, but overall, a very disappointing year, given how last year McLaren were knocking on the door of both titles again. But I'm also taking off one subgrade from the overall team because of the treatment of Sergio Perez, because Martin Whitmarsh lied. He said straight up that both his drivers would be given another shot next year because of how bad the car was, and Perez ends up being the scapegoat for a poor McLaren team, so they don't want to lose Kevin Magnussen that badly. And it's kind of a shame because it made Perez look worse than what he really was as well. And that was just a whole unnecessary bit of drama, and I don't rate McLaren for doing that at all. I think Perez should have been given a second chance. But yeah, overall, McLaren, rather disappointing. Let's move on to Force India and their season. A year where Force India were probably aiming for the top 5, and they were looking quite good for that early on, with McLaren looking really, really bland and average early on, but McLaren outdeveloped Force India over the course of the season. And as a result, Force India kind of fell into this obscure 6th place kind of spot for pretty much the entire rest of the year. Which is kind of a shame given their drivers and their talents, and they started out so strong, and I'll talk about that again later towards the end of the team review, but there's a big reason for that. Anyway, Paul di Resta, The rest of his highest finish was a 4th place finish in Bahrain, matching his career high he had in Singapore last year. He finished in the points 9 times with a total of 48, beaten by Sergio Perez on the final Grand Prix. And the thing is, of the 9 times he was in the points last season, 7 of them came in the first 8 races. It's almost seeming like the mid-season break kind of made the rest the worse. It was really weird. Also had that 5-race retirement streak in him towards the middle part of the season, where the rest went from a top-grade prospect that could have easily gotten a seat at Lotus or Ferrari next year, like the rumours were saying, and ended up falling right off the face of Formula 1. It's kind of sad, really, in a way, how quickly things can change in Formula 1, a sport where a lot of it comes down to what have you done for me lately. He came back a little bit towards the end, was decent in India, had a very solid 6th place drive in Abu Dhabi on the one-stopper as well. But overall, I think the Resta was quite disappointing. I think the Resta was meant to be the guy that was going to show some real progress in his 3rd year, his 3rd season in Formula 1. And, I thought that he was going to turn the corner and turn himself into a top name. Hasn't really happened this year. Again, that's not totally down on him. I think the team in general were a bit disappointing, especially in the second half of the year. But I was thinking the Resta would be able to turn himself into a top contender with a top level team next year. But it just didn't work out for him. Made a lot of mistakes in the middle part of the season as well, which made me think, maybe Force India need to let him go, because I think they've had 3 years and he's not really progressed anywhere in his career. Because he was able to score good places last year with Force India, him and Hulkenberg did. As for Adrian Sutil, it started well for him. I remember when he led in Australia during the first Grand Prix of the year. His highest finish was 5th, and that was in Monaco. And Monaco was by a country mile Sutil's strongest drive of the year. He was passing Ferraris. He was showing some real confidence to be able to overtake cars consistently around Monaco on a track which is nearly impossible to do. Overall, he only scored 29 points. He finished in the points 8 times. He had, I think, the 2nd highest amount of retirements of any driver in the field, and none of them were really his fault except for Korea. And even so, I mean, when you spin a car 9 times out of 10, it's not race ending, and he just happened to very unluckily catch the side of Mark Webber's car, and eventually the damage put him out of the Grand Prix, and it caused Webber's car to have a small, insignificant fire. But overall, I think Sutil was just average. I mean, he was outpointed by Paul di Resta, nearly 2-1. He was very poor in qualifying, if I remember correctly, especially in the second half of the year. Failing to get out of Q3 sometimes is just disappointing. And just overall, Sutil just seemed to just be there. I mean, he didn't really do anything that was that special besides Australia, where he led for a little bit, and Monaco, which seemed to light a fire underneath him. Just besides that, it's one of those things where it's just kind of disappointing, really, more than anything else. And Sutil's now 30 years old. This is his 2nd bite of the Formula 1 cherry. He came back after the bar fight incident. He was average this year, but it seemed to be good enough for Sauber. So, hey, maybe Sauber will get the best out of Sutil. But to me, I always thought he was going to leave Force India at the end of the year. I don't think he was ever good enough to retain his seat. And with better free agents available, it makes sense that Force India dumped him and di Resta and cleared the decks in a push for the top 5. The car was great first half of the year. It was challenging for podiums and showed some real promise. Force India seemed to be the team that took advantage the most of the seeming, of the seeming fall of McLaren. I think Force India were the team that had the greatest benefits. Paul di Resta was showing some great drives as well. They still qualified quite badly, but their race pace was so good they got them into the points quite often. I mean, despite the double retirement failure farce at Malaysia, the car was decent, and until the Pirelli tyre change happened. And when the Pirelli tyre change happened, it seemed like Force India lost all of their speed. They were dropping back to teams like Toro Rosso, to Sauber, to teams like that, and it really hurt them towards the end of the season. Yeah, again, they came back a little bit. And it seemed to just fall about a little bit there, and it's kind of a shame, because I think they were the team that was most affected by the Pirelli tyre change, just dropping from a decent higher midfield team to a team that was fighting more with Toro Rosso, with Williams, and just generally speaking was quite disappointing. Force India are capable of better than this, and now they have Nico Hülkenberg and Sergio Perez as their drivers for next season. They really have no excuse to improve. Vijay Mallya needs to open his wallet and pour money into that team, because they are capable of great things. And now with two great drivers, probably the third best driver lineup in Formula 1 behind Ferrari and Mercedes, there's no reason why they can't get into the top 5 next year. It will take a bit of a push, but if anyone can do it, Force India can. And finally, let's talk about Sauber, and one of the drivers that impressed me most over the course of the season, especially in the second half, was Nico Hülkenberg, for many reasons. Hülkenberg had a phenomenal season, all things considered, because it seemed like everything that could go wrong to Nico Hülkenberg went wrong. He went to a Sauber team that showed some real potential last season in a car that had a bit of a tactical X-factor about it, was able to run less pit stops than a lot of other guys, was really good on tyres, and showed a lot of raw power and potential in that Sauber car. So I thought Hülkenberg going to Sauber would be a good fit, because he was a better driver than Sergio Perez and Kamui Kobayashi. So thinking if Perez and Kobayashi can get this out of the car, Hülkenberg can do the same. Turns out Sauber kind of fell off the wagon first half of this season. They didn't show that same exciting kind of tactical pace that Lotus, for example, Lotus seemed to have last year and this year. And Sauber seemed to fall off the wagon first off. They're one of the lower down, probably the 8th best team in Formula 1. And despite that, Hülkenberg was able to get in the points 4 times the first half of the year, in a Sauber car that really was a bit of a donkey. Again, even worse than the McLaren to an extent. But I think Hülkenberg was just waiting for an update that could make the team a little bit better. And it did. It came, and I think after Singapore we got to Italy, and it just seemed to light a fire under Hülkenberg. He qualified in 3rd around Monza, finished in 5th, only losing out to the Red Bulls and the Ferraris, and went on a tear. I mean, the Korea drive was one of the best of the season, being able to put on a defensive driving masterclass with 3 world champions behind you in Alonso, Button and Hamilton, and be able to bring the car home in 4th place was an absolutely outstanding performance. He got the car into the points way more. He was qualifying regularly in Q3, and it showed what many people kind of already knew, and that was Hülkenberg is a top-tier talent, kind of held back by lack of funding. Remember, he was unpaid throughout the season, cancelled his contract with Sauber, was effectively driving as a free agent, and despite all that, was able to do a brilliant job with a very below-par car throughout the first half of the year, scored 43 points from Monza onwards, and was able to finish in the top 10 of the Drivers' Championship for the first time in his career. And it seems like his career's had nothing but sidesteps. Now he's heading back to Force India for the second time, but I really hope he has a really great season next year, because if there's one guy in the field that deserves a break, it's Nico Hülkenberg. And he, I think, was incredibly impressive this season, deserves maximum praise for pretty much getting blood out of a stone in that Sauber car, which can't really be said about Esteban Gutierrez in the car next to him. But I will say this, for one season improvement, I think Esteban Gutierrez was probably the most improved driver of the season. From where he started at the start of this season to where he finished at the end, I think Gutierrez showed some promise and showed some real improvements. His highest finish was a 7th in Japan, which was probably the headlining performance of Gutierrez's Formula 1 career to date. Just about giving Nico Rosberg a run for his money in the Mercedes car. Possibly a Rookie of the Year contender for Gutierrez. I mean, at the start of the year, he was wild, he was reckless, he was showing he was looking like a rookie, and he had that awful crash in China when he drove completely into the back of Jean-Eric Vergne when he got his braking completely out of whack. But overall, he showed improvement. He got better, he got more consistent. When the car got better, he got more consistent. He was qualifying well as well, and his racecraft was definitely improving. And I think Gutierrez has probably done enough to give himself a second year in Formula 1. Whether that's with Sauber or not remains to be seen, because I know Caterham are knocking on the door as well to bring in Gutierrez next season. But I think overall, despite his rough start, I think Gutierrez definitely showed some promise towards the end, and I think he deserves a second chance, just to see what he can do in his second year. If anything, Romain Grosjean kind of proved how giving a guy 2 seasons over 1 season can prove that you can get the best out of somebody. And maybe, just maybe, Gutierrez can build on his solid second half of last season, and maybe turn himself into someone that could be a decent mid-level driver. Remember, he's the youngest driver in the field. He's only 22 years old. He won't be obviously for next season, but he was the youngest guy in the field, and despite a crazy amount of pressure joining a decent midfield team right off the bat, I think Gutierrez definitely showed something. As for the car, it started awful, really, but greatly improved in the second half of the season. Again, showed some real potential. Kind of found that 2012 Sauber pace that was so elusive for him to start this season. And they could easily challenge, Force India and McLaren for midfield spots and decent points next year if, again, they can work on their consistency and they can maybe find some of that pace they had in 2012. I'm not as confident given their lack of money issues, and that's why I'm taking away 1 subgrade from the overall team, again, because the treatment of Hulkenberg was completely unfair and could have jeopardized their season right from the start if Hulkenberg had decided to walk away, which he luckily didn't. But again, the handling of the situation has been quite poor, and maybe they should bring in Sergei Sorokin next year and to give the team a little bit of financial stability, because that's clearly what they need at the moment. But overall, a half-decent year for Sauber. Hopefully they can build on what Hulkenberg left behind.